So you just finished watching a video from History.com that reviewed the Louisiana Purchase. We learned in our last lesson that we, as Americans, purchased this area, the Louisiana Territory, in the white on the map that you see in front of you, from France. Right? France needed to make some money, and we wanted all of that land, including the area down here in New Orleans, which is where the mouth of the Mississippi River is. All right, that would allow us to travel up and down the Mississippi and ship goods, which made it a lot easier than traveling over the Appalachian Mountains by wagon or by whatever other method. And so today we're going to talk about, now that we have this land, what are we going to do with it? All right, and so as you may already know, there were two gentlemen, Lewis and Clark, who led an expedition starting in the year 1804 to this land to find out what was going on there. So what I'm going to have you looking for today in the reading is, first of all, what kind of things were Lewis and Clark doing on their expedition? They were gone for 2 years, and actually people thought that they weren't coming back. People thought that something terrible happened to them and they weren't making it back, but they did show up and they had all kinds of good things to share. All right, and so you're looking for, what did they do while they were gone? And then also, you've probably heard of Sacagawea. What did she do to help them out? And you can see a picture at the top of the text of her, and she's pointing, and that kind of indicates one of the things that she did to help. So the first thing we're going to do is read from this section, and then I'll give you some other details that you might not already know about the Lewis and Clark expedition. So it says in the reading, shortly before he completed the Louisiana Purchase, President Jefferson made plans for an expedition to explore the huge territory. 2 former soldiers, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, led the group. They would map the Louisiana Territory and would also look for the Northwest Passage to the Pacific Ocean. Jefferson asked them to take notes on the land, plants, animals, and American Indian tribes that they came across in their travels. He also wanted the explorers to scout locations for trading posts and settlements. In May 1804, Lewis and Clark started up the Missouri River from St. Louis, Missouri. They took more than 40 other men with them, including Clark's slave York. York would become the first black man to cross North America. As the expedition moved along the Missouri, the men found high, cold plateaus. The explorers spent the winter with a group of American Indians, the Mandans, in what is now North Dakota. There Lewis and Clark met Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman. The next year she joined the group as they crossed the Rocky Mountains and struggled through early snows. She helped them speak with the tribes that they met along the way. The group followed the Snake and Columbia rivers, finally reaching the Pacific Ocean in November of 1805. On the return journey, Lewis and Clark mapped 2 new routes across the Rocky Mountains. In 1806, they returned as heroes. Now settlers could move even farther west. And of course, like we talked about yesterday, that's fabulous. They could move further west, but don't forget who is already there, the Native Americans. Okay. While they were on their journey, they came across groups of Native Americans. And that's one of the things that Sacagawea helped with, was to translate. When I say translate, she was able to speak with them. And of course, them seeing another Native American probably made them more peaceful towards Lewis and Clark's group. The other thing it says Sacagawea did was basically show them where they were going. Okay, she was kind of like a guide for them. What did they do while they were there? I had you looking for that. Okay, they were actually recording the new things they found. Okay, they were mapping their route. Their goal, one of their goals, was to find a Northwest Passage, which was a water route all the way to the ocean. Now, they did not find that, and the reason why they didn't find it is because it doesn't exist. Okay, but here are some things that you may not know about the Lewis and Clark expedition that I found on History.com that are kind of cool. All right, first of all, before they went, they really didn't know what to expect, but Thomas Jefferson just knew they were going to find big herds of woolly mammoths and giant sloths. They didn't find either one, but it's kind of cool to think that they might have. Another thing that happened was the Spanish. Now, remember, the Spanish still have acquired land in North America that does not belong to the Americans yet. All right. And so the Spanish were worried when they knew that they were going out west, because they actually had some property in the southwest area. And they thought that if Lewis and Clark went out there, they would try to take that land for America. And so the Spanish, along with group of Comanche Indians sent 4 different groups out looking for Lewis and Clark, trying to find them before they were able to take their land. Now, Lewis and Clark were out to take their land, and actually, the Spanish never found Lewis and Clark on their entire trip. If they would have, they were going to take them back in chains, basically, and take them prisoner. So, good thing that didn't happen. I know the book mentions that Clark brought his slave York with him. All right, York was a really important member of their group. All right, we know that York was African American, and at that time, African Americans and women were not allowed to vote. Well, something interesting that happened on the trip was they were trying to decide a place for their winter camp in 1805, and they allowed Clark and Sacagawea to vote on where they should place their camp. So this is the first time in recorded history that a Native American woman, along with that, and a African American were allowed to vote. Okay. Something else interesting is what they took with them. Now imagine this is a 2-year-long trip. Okay, they took 200 pounds of gunpowder and 400 pounds of lead and an experimental air rifle with them. And so I think they were very worried about what they were going to come across. Fortunately, they didn't have to use much of that at all. The cool thing about their air rifle is it fired 20 shots after you would like pump the air into it. It would fire 20 continuous shots. And it didn't make a very loud noise at all. So that was kind of cool. The only time that they had to use their weapons was against the Blackfeet Indians, and that was getting close to coming back on their journey. 3 of the soldiers came up against, and 2 of the natives ended up dead. So that did happen. You may have heard that Sacagawea came across her long-lost brother while they were on the journey. Sacagawea had been taken from her tribe, and they 5 years before that. And all of a sudden, while they're out west, they run into her brother, and he happens to be the chief of the tribe, and they realize who it is and what's going on, and they're able to reunite. That really helps out Lewis and Clark because they needed to trade for horses. They were getting ready to cross the Rocky Mountains, and they needed horses. And so because of the relationship between Sacagawea and the Shoshone, she was able to bargain out horses for them. So that was a good deal for them. And something else you may not know is, they took 40 people with them. Only 1 man died on the trip. He didn't die very far into the trip. He died, remember they started around St. Louis, Missouri. He died in Sioux City, Iowa. So we know Iowa isn't very far from St. Louis, Missouri. And it was on their way out. He hadn't even made it out west yet. And actually, he didn't die of anything, like you might suspect. He didn't die from Native Americans shooting at him or anything like that. He actually died from a ruptured appendix. So that's kind of interesting. Now, there was a little incident. One of the men in the Lewis and Clark expedition was out hunting one day, and somehow he mistook Lewis for an elk, and he shot him. Unfortunately, it was in the rear end, so Lewis got shot in the butt. And so for several weeks, he spent on his stomach laying in a canoe going down the river because he couldn't set on his bottom because he had been mistaken for an elk, which is kind of funny, you gotta admit. Glad it wasn't me, though. Something else you may or may not know, Lewis kind of had a rough go. He actually died of very mysterious circumstances. So they found him with 2 bullet wounds on the Natchez Trace after he returned. There's some conspiracy theories out there that say that someone shot him, that he, maybe someone that didn't like him or want him doing what he was doing. Perhaps that there were the innkeepers shot him for his money. But when you get back to school, we're actually going to look at this a little more closely if we get a chance. So we'll just stay tuned for that one. All right. And then one more thing you may or may not know. Clark actually adopted Sacagawea's children. So on the trip, her son, John Baptiste, was with her. They called him Pump. Okay. So Clark actually offered to adopt her son as he was his own. And she originally turned him down, but she actually ended up taking him up on the offer, and he helped to pay for John Baptiste's education in St. Louis. Sacagawea died 6 years after they returned from their trip in 1812, and she already had another little girl named Lizette. So Lizette was also adopted by Clark, and So now he has adopted both of her children. So we don't really know much about what happened to Lizette as she grew up, but we do know that John Baptiste traveled to Europe and then he returned and he worked as a trapper and a wilderness guide. So it's kind of cool that Clark took on adopting Sacagawea's children. All right. So tomorrow we're going to learn more about how we were gaining territory in North America as the United States. The next thing that you need to do is complete the Google form with a couple questions about what you've learned today. And then after that, you're going to watch one more short video from history.com on Lewis and Clark. Okay, it's kind of neat. Also, on this last slide, you can see the trip that Lewis and Clark took and where they went in the West. All right, we'll talk to you later.